Well, most of this year, of course, the discussion has been that we should be more self-sufficient. And, of course, the fact that most of us think that products from China are cheaper is just a myth. Well, this is quite surprising. Joining us to explain further is Steve Eagle, co-founder and director of How to Buy Australian Made, and that's exactly what we want to do. Steve, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Lovely to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. This is a message that we probably need to get out, but people also need to be confident that the products are comparable in price. Now, let's get down to the facts of this. It is a myth, you consider.
Yeah, absolutely. So earlier this year, there was a study done by the Centre of Future Work under the Institute of Australia, and the director of that study found out that actually by comparing the high wage in Australia versus low wage in Asian countries, which is typically where we get our product from, that under studying that and the cost impact of that Australian goods are actually globally competitive cost-wise. And that sort of challenges, I guess, this perception that we have traditionally that, high-cost products come from high-cost countries. Actually, that trend's been reversing in the last sort of 5 to 8 years.
Ah, okay. It hasn't been, sort of widespread, that information. So, I mean, I've got to still say that if you do go to the bigger department stores and so on, the cheaper ones, you can pick up a kettle for $20-something and, that sort of thing. And I guess that's what is attracting people still. I mean, how are we going to break down this myth?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And I think really the understanding of how to break this down comes from also looking at the quality of those products as well. Now, it's no surprise to a lot of consumers that a lot of those cheaper products also come with an expiry date. They're sort of built with a degree of obsolescence in the design. Typically, what we see with Australian-produced products is that our local regulations around, quality standards and the way the workplace is set up, the way manufacturing is worked and legislated, avoids those sort of quality issues. So while we can compare dollar-to-dollar value and be competitive, there's also a big story about the quality that Australia products have and how that can be exported to other countries in the world.
The thing, I suppose, is also that the big retail outlets that stock these items from Asia that get the customers in are going to have to start thinking differently and stock Australian products as well.
Yeah, they really will have to do that. And encouragingly, we've already seen some action at that side of the story in this year. So even as early as sort of March, April, Woolworths announced that they're going to consider putting in an all-Australian aisle in their supermarkets, which I just think is a great initiative. But we're also seeing local governments and the federal government start to support Australian manufacturing more than they've done before. So even with the budget announcement of last Tuesday, there was over $7 billion worth of incentives put forward for small businesses and producers of Australian manufactured goods. So we're definitely seeing the tide turn in terms of what support's available for small businesses looking to buy and sell Australian-made goods.
Mm. Well, we've got to get sort of the situation balanced, I suppose. We all want Australia to strive economically, and if any better time than now, without a doubt, it is the time for us to be doing it. Are goods being manufactured at this stage in Australia? We've seen a lot go offshore.
Yeah, we really have. And the way that the media has sort of focused on this story, and we can talk about sort of the last 10 to 15 years even, it's been focused around this sort of notion of offshoring. A lot of that happened around the automotive industry and the aerospace industry, and that's really where Australia felt the impacts of it. If you look at a layer below that, right, so getting away from big industry and going one layer down into the supply base that produces the parts and components and technology for those big industries. Actually, that layer of manufacturing in Australia still exists, and it's actually still quite healthy. So it's moving more away from big industry and more down to micro businesses, the smaller and medium-sized enterprises. That's where the opportunity exists. And if we look at the economic activity from this year, you'll see that it's really been big industry that's been impacted the most. most, right? Through the logistics constraints that we've had, the border closures and lockdown, availability of workers to get to the manufacturing sites, all of these sort of things have impacted. On the other hand, if we look at the areas in the economy that are doing really well, it's online business. The small businesses, online sellers on Amazon and eBay, Shopify, these kinds of retail outlets, picking up products, whether they're made in Australia or made internationally, and really sort of driving the economy that way. And those small businesses account for, they're the third largest contributor to the Australian economy, for one. They account for about $150 billion worth of revenue for Australia. So really allowing those small businesses access to manufacturers in Australia is where the action will happen.
Is anything in place for this to happen and grow from this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the government just in the last week, off their budget announcement, has addressed it in three ways. So they're looking at supporting businesses in terms of funding for manufacturing. So there's more than $1.5 billion invested over the next 4 years for manufacturers to improve their technology and improve the way that they process their materials. Also in terms of job creation and skill increases. So there's now really good subsidies, up to $200 a week for 12 months for people hiring 30-year-olds or under. And then also in terms of research and development, there's been another $2 billion announced for incentives around research and development, and also $1.9 billion announced in terms of funding for universities. So, the money's being really made available, and it's quite smart in the way that it's being allocated.
Well, no one would argue against that. I think that sounds absolutely wonderful. Let's look at a few reasons why we should actually shop locally, Australian, for example. And obviously, if we haven't got the international shipping costs and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. So reducing that international shipping cost and the logistics cost associated with that, that's really significant. In a normal year, that would normally account for about 30% or 35% of a cost of a product that's imported. In this year, because of the logistics constraints, we've seen that number increase. So that can account for as much as 50% of the shelf price that you pay. It would just be in that logistics. Now, there's also other cost factors as well there. If you think about the cost of labour, which is another one that always comes up as a potential reason why Australia can't compete. Well, actually, over the last 8 years, what we've seen up in Asia is the cost of labour has doubled in those last 8 years, and it's continuing to grow. So off the back of the economic success that Asia's enjoyed in the last 30 years, now the cost of living and the cost of producing is increasing as well. So that's now growing at over 10% a year, and that's not slowing down. If you contrast that to what's happening in the Western world, those growth rates look like sort of 2 to 3% year on year. So it doesn't take long for the Asian economy to sort of catch up and actually create an environment where Australian manufacturing and Australian costs are actually really competitive.
Well, you've also suggested that Australian manufacturers might start to use automation instead of labour.
Yes, exactly. So, one thing that Australia really does well is we're a very innovative country, and we also have great standards in our manufacturing as well. So because of that innovation and the legislation that holds our high standards up, automation is often a go-to for manufacturers to be efficient and compete globally as well. So, in those high-tech industries and in the areas where Australia really excels, in terms of metal production and processing metals, and then also plastics production, processing plastics. These kinds of things can be highly automated, and in Australia we can really benefit from that.
So you're not only suggesting that people buy online, that to get Australian products they could get it overnight sometimes and not wait months, but you're also suggesting that retail outlets may well start to have aisles of Australian products. You've tried that before with the Australian-made label, but it sort of doesn't jump out at you that much, does it?
Yeah, look, I think there's been a bit of confusion probably over the last sort of 5 to 10 years around what that Australian-made logo really stands for, right? And we're talking about the Australian-made campaign with the green triangle and the kangaroo on it. Yeah. What they've really done is diversify the way that label can be applied. So they started off with originally just having Australian-made and that logo. after doing that, what they realized was that there's actually many different layers of Australian production. So if you think of sort of food production as a category, right, you can have grown in Australia, you can have Australian produced in Australia, you can have packaged in Australia. There's all different layers of the Australian component of that. And I guess what they've done by diversifying that logo is try and highlight exactly where the value is for Australian business in those products that we see. So I think a smart way for retailers to display this would be something like an Australian-made shelf or an Australian-made aisle in the supermarket, something like that, where consumers looking to buy Australian-made can go there and know that at least a portion of those products are produced in Australia, if not the whole thing. And now our perspective is that 1% Australian-made is better than no percent. So we'd like to see that obviously grow over time, but any move in that direction I think is positive.
I still think the important thing for the consumer is price point.
You're absolutely right. And price point will always be a significant factor to shoppers. What's interesting about price point, and especially if we focus on the retail end, is that even Asian consumers who are typically sort of associated with cheaper retail pricing, they're even investing more in buying Australian-made products. So there's businesses like Nutrition Depot, which is a brand of supplements distribution that is now distributing throughout Asia, Western products at Western retail pricing and doing very well. There's also companies like in northern New South Wales, there's a company just this year called Bambouli, and Bambouli were actually looking to do eco-sustainable toilet paper, of all things, out of China, but then the coronavirus happened and Wuhan went into lockdown, etc. So they weren't able to source from China in the way that they thought. So they actually localized their production to Australia. They found a supplier in Queensland, and that supplier was actually able to price match their Chinese supplier on toilet paper. So that's a remarkable story if you think about it, that we can have eco-sustainable toilet paper made in Australia to all of the higher quality and high standards that we have and be price competitive with Asian product. It's really encouraging.
They should have been on the shelves when the start of the pandemic happened.
Yeah, I know. Hey, hindsight's perfect, as they say, but they'll be really well positioned, I think, in the next sort of 6 months to not only supply Australia, but then also actually to export. So it creates a great opportunity for that business, but then also their manufacturer to start a global footprint.
Well, people, I'm sure, want to be very loyal to Australian-made products, particularly with what we've been through now. And I guess it's got to now sort of rely on heavy marketing to not only make us more aware that it is competitive with the Asian products, but the quality is better. And it's presented in a modern way, not sort of just a little green triangle label hanging off a product. We need more than that. We need to explode this.
I totally agree with you, and I think really it can happen at the consumer level. Your listeners who are tuned in today, but then also the retailers and those people who are distributing product through Australia can look online and start to identify where the Australian products are. That's where the economy is doing really well at the moment. Online sales is really going well. It's getting access to Australian products through those online channels that's going to really open this up, and I think we really have a bright future. In light of what the government's just announced in the last week, and then also the way that consumers are thinking in this year, I think has really changed. A lot of people have identified that Australian-made actually really does matter, and there's a significant opportunity now for people to take part in that.
Very well said, Steve. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. It's lovely to be a part of your show.
Thank you, Steve Eagle.